Hi, this is Swapnil Bhartiya, and we are here at KubeCon in San Diego, and today we have with us once again Mark Shuttleworth, CEO and founder of Ubuntu and Canonical. This is 15th anniversary of Ubuntu and Canonical. I want to, because I have known you for long. I still remember in India when we were walking, I think it was 2005, and your interview, and you were talking about, you went to space and everything. So I just want to reflect briefly. How do you look at these 15 years?
Well, it's been an incredible privilege to be part of this growth of open source, to be part of the sort of spreading of free software, to be part of this community, to work with the people that I get to work with every day, both at Canonical and in the industry. I wanted to be part of something that was, enabling change all over the world at the same time, right? And Ubuntu has done that. It lights a fire for entrepreneurs. It enables giant businesses, and it provides a way for the contributions of people who are really passionate about what they're doing with free software and open source to flow to the widest possible audience. So I'm very lucky.
I remember early days, there are a couple of contributions that Ubuntu and Canonical made. You changed the culture of open source as well. If Linux made it, people comfortable with open source in enterprise environment. I remember early days forums. If you go to Fedora forum, whatever forum, it was expected to read the manual. With Ubuntu, you guys created, that anybody can walk in, anybody can ask questions. You were shipping CDs back in the early days from your pocket. So people don't talk about that, but I think you also, when we talk about the welcoming culture, I think Ubuntu and Canonical played a big role there as well.
Well, I think if you look at what it takes to make a platform that people can trust, you can't just be focused on the cleverest code. You have to think about security. You have to think about quality. You have to think about documentation. And so it was just very clear that there were lots of people who wanted to be part of something like free software who weren't necessarily just focused on code. And we were able to show, and I think lots of communities have really benefited from this idea, that if you enable people to participate in many ways and you recognize those contributions, then your story gets richer, right? Ubuntu is a much better story because of the diversity of the people that participate, and that shines through every time people touch it. So, I'm proud of that.
And if you look at the evolution of Canonical, you started with Ubuntu, and you had a good logo, good tagline, Linux for human beings. Mm-hmm. But today, if you look at Canonical, it's a totally different market you're operating. So can you talk about what is Canonical today?
So essentially, Ubuntu is the cleanest, simplest expression of the highest quality of the free software stack, right? When you start something, you have to find a place that you can make a difference, that you can make a name for yourself, that you can create a brand. And the Linux desktop was the piece that essentially people had said they didn't care about, but it was the piece that students and entrepreneurs and developers really did care about. So it was the right place for us essentially to say, we care about the developers, the creators, the people who don't have a lot of money, but they have essentially the right to benefit from free software in the Stallman sense, right? The contributions of many people. The name Ubuntu essentially expresses that. It says, look, this thing will be great because we will attract a diversity of people and encourage them to be great. That's what will make it great, right? Not me, not the kernel, but that rounded view, right? So that allowed us to essentially stand for something different. We wanted it to be freely available. We wanted it to be available on a regular cadence. People said that was crazy, and we wanted it to be to represent the very best of the latest work of the free software community. And so those key ideas, that's still absolutely the case. If you go and look at the Raspberry Pi or the little Intel NUC that's going into some sort of giant industrial machinery, the people who are putting software on those things, they still want a high quality, low cost access to the very best of the free software world on a predictable timeline. You know, those core ideas are still there for Ubuntu on the mainframe, for Ubuntu on a Raspberry Pi, for Ubuntu in a Kubernetes cluster, for Ubuntu on the public cloud. You know, we've taken, as a community and as a company, we've taken Ubuntu, you know, all the way effectively across the full range of places where people are using Linux seriously. But the core ideas, the economics of Ubuntu, the culture of Ubuntu, the release cycle of Ubuntu, the maintenance cycle of Ubuntu, those haven't changed.
Well, I will get back to the question that I was trying to ask about, you know, the evolution of the company. But since you are talking about desktop, there's a effort going on between the GNOME community and the KDE community to somehow, because it's a very, I was talking to Linus Torvalds and it said one of the reasons Linux is not successful on desktop is fragmentation. KDE is a different word, GNOME is a different word. You have already, you know, burned yourself with VLN and Mir and all those things, but now they're working together to kind of, are you aware of that development and what do you think about it?
Yeah, and I think we're you know, playing our part in helping to organize, for example, the recent summit that brought folks together. The fact that people have different interests and different approaches is part of the beauty of open source. So that's fragmentation. Yes, it is fragmentation, but it's also part of the possibility of it, right? The fact that people are willing to find ways to work together is also part of the beauty of it. So, you know, I don't think anybody is in a position to sort of dictate how it's going to play out. Everything you've described, I think, is healthy and good in the community. It's important to me to think carefully about how to enable people to get access to open source efficiently, no matter what their preferred desktop environment. You know, we're working with the WSL team at Microsoft to enable people to get access to the best free software stack effectively in WSL. And you know, that isn't a desktop and it isn't a server environment. It's its own unique thing. It never existed. Something like that never existed before, right? So I kind of think that open source and free software will go into places that we can't imagine. At the end of the day, the stuff that we do well in the Ubuntu community and at Canonical is good release management, good discipline on what goes into a particular release, enabling different people who have different interests all to work together to get that release out, bringing a very high quality security story to that. Ubuntu consistently ranks #1 for security, both in terms of proactive, like what we built into it so that when there's a problem, that problem doesn't spread as much, and reactive in terms of when there's a problem, we fix that and we make that fix available at a high quality to everybody. So all of those things, I think, you know, define Ubuntu. The particular use case, well, that's up to the end user. It's not up to us.
But Ubuntu has been a bit opinionated in the past. Like Mir was there, and then Unity was there.
So Mir is still there.
Yeah.
If you look, you know, so Mir sits between Wayland and between the desktop environments, and you know, if I have a frustration with the free software community and open source community, is that it tends to pick, you know, huge mailing list fights over stuff that many of the people participating aren't necessarily experts in. You know, the Mir team still making Mir. They're still very proud of the fact that it's a very high quality, very high performance display management framework. They switched to using Wayland to get the GL frames, but at the end of the day, Mir plays its part. And I think it's important that we and other people like us sometimes are willing to go and do things, even if it isn't particularly popular, or if it becomes essentially controversial. Right?
Right.
Maybe sometimes when something's, you know, turning into a flame fest, it would be more important to sort of tell people that usually those things become irrational, right?
And it happens quite a lot in this community, so there's nothing new there.
We're all getting a little older, so maybe we can hope that it'll happen a little less.
Right. One more thing I'm interested in talking to you about is one thing that Canonical does differently than SUSE or Red Hat is that Ubuntu is free. You know, anybody can take it. I was talking to Chris Wright. He's the CTO of Red Hat, and having a conversation about commercialization of open source. Some people have started talking about commercial open source or cost. But if you look at Canonical or Red Hat or SUSE, you guys have been doing commercial open source from day one. So what do you think about this new?
I think it's healthy that there is a framework for commercialization, and that is in tension with the idea that everything should be completely frictionless and free, right? So we've gone a long way towards enabling literally zero cost access to lots of the open source stack. But we do have commercial offerings, we do have commercial rules, we do have to pay the people that make that work. One of the things that I'm, just delighted to be able to tell people is that this year, after 15 years, Ubuntu pays for itself. So for 15 years, I was worried that if I got hit by a bus, the world would lose Ubuntu. But now it's okay, I cannot worry so much about buses, right? So we've found a way to make it sustainable, even though everything that we've always done for free, we continue to do for free, right? We've layered on top of that things that we can do for very large organizations, complex organizations, sophisticated organizations that want more than we can possibly do for free. So we've done that without taking away what we said 15 years ago we believed should be free. So, I respect the Red Hat approach. You essentially fragment and you say there's a free version that serves a purpose for the community and serves a purpose for sort of forward-looking R&D, and then there's an enterprise version that serves a purpose. We just do it differently. We say there's only one version, standard Ubuntu, and it comes with a bunch of useful things that are free, that are enterprise grade, and then we have additional things that we do or that we allow people to do with Ubuntu that you can't do for free effectively. Those are just different approaches. Mm-hmm. I do think it's important for open source to have a business model, because at the end of the day, code has to be able to breathe and it has to have a future for people to want to adopt it today. No one wants to adopt code today that's going to be abandoned tomorrow. And so I think there's a pretty clear understanding there needs to be some model. It's great to be able to say that Ubuntu has found that and is now a sustainable proposition.
Right. And I'll come back to the question that I asked earlier. What is Canonical today? Are you a Linux vendor? Are you a cloud vendor? Because you're doing a lot of work in the OpenStack space, and then you're doing a lot of work in Kubernetes space, and a lot of things are happening. Like SUSE pulled out of OpenStack market. Docker got acquired by, their unit got acquired by Mirantis. So first of all, I want to understand what is Canonical today, and second is what are your thoughts on these acquisitions or the way movements are happening within the industry?
Sure. So we're an open source vendor, right? Linux is one part of that, but there are many other parts of it. We essentially divide that into two offerings. There is an infrastructure offering, where we would cover everything that's a sort of open source that's sort of associated with Linux, the OS, the private cloud, containers, so Kubernetes, Ceph, OpenStack, kernel, KVM, all of those sorts of things. That's infrastructure open source, and that's one sort of package offering that we do. And then there's the application layer, which is everything else on GitHub, right? So open source for organizations is more than Linux, right? It's all of infrastructure and increasingly all of applications as well. We address that full stack. We're not a public cloud, we'll never be a public cloud. It's a great privilege for us to work very closely with the public clouds because we essentially enable, it's kind of a three-way relationship. Users of the cloud want to get access to the very latest capabilities in the clouds, and the clouds want to innovate and they want to differentiate. But users also want the ability to believe that if they wanted to move or they needed to move, they can. So we work with the public clouds to ensure that if you're using Ubuntu on any of the public clouds and the cloud has innovated in some meaningful way, that's immediately available to you as a user of Ubuntu, but it's still a standardized environment effectively, so that 99% of what you would want to move, if you chose to move, you could move, right? So I think have found a happy relationship with the public clouds and with users of public clouds, which makes Ubuntu the most common environment, the standard environment, effectively, for people working on the public cloud. And I think, we're only just at the dawn of the open source era when you think about it as the default way people do software. So there was a time when, open source was a kind of an ideological proposition. And then there was a time when it was really focused on one part of the stack, Linux. But most of the other stuff essentially was untouched by open source. Now I think we're moving into an era where not only is the average piece of software that's interesting to people open source, but it's no longer just software companies that are driving that open source, right? It's car companies and media companies and telecommunications companies, right? Open source is becoming, it's going beyond vendors. It's going beyond software companies. That raises all sorts of complicated questions. The people behind some of that software no longer want to be in the business of selling support or even doing release management. If it works for them, then they're happy. And if anybody else wants to use it as open source, that's great. So we're sort of having to rethink what the nature of vendors is in this new open source world. And I'm excited that Canonical's part of that bigger venture, right? For most people, if they want access to that world, Ubuntu is the best place to start.
Right, but you did not answer my question about Docker and the SUSE's movement there. How do you perceive SUSE pulling out of OpenStack world?
So my view is that if you want to move the world forward, you have to think how to deliver a substantial improvement in either the technology or the price, like a substantial improvement. I think there were a lot of vendors that came to OpenStack with the idea that they could come in and they could offer something that was like 5% cheaper than VMware, right? And it's not enough to do that. I think if you really want to help enterprises get to the next level for their private infrastructure, you have to say, look, here's your VMware. It's good quality. It's well understood. It's quite expensive. Here is a much more cost-effective, much more automated, low-cost virtualization infrastructure. If you can't essentially show that significant change, right, then people in the end can't really justify the risk of moving to something new, exploring something new. Canonical and Ubuntu really deliver. We're very focused on delivering the very best open source stack, OpenStack, Kubernetes, whatever it is, at a significantly better price than your previous generation was priced at, right? And so we've got a thriving practice around OpenStack because people want that. But many of the early vendors that came to OpenStack that thought, this would let them compete with Amazon while keeping prices high for the enterprise buyer, those guys have suffered, right? If you came in and said, I'm going to offer something that's complicated and expensive, well, then you've suffered, right? And those businesses have failed. If you've come in and said, no, we're going to dramatically make it much cheaper than VMware, much cheaper than Red Hat, the other sort of on-prem options, then you're thriving, right?
And in case of Docker, the same day when they got acquired, their chunk got acquired by Mirantis, they also raised some $32 million. What do you make out of that?
Well, I think clearly there was a split in the inside Docker. Some people wanted to focus on some interesting next generation technology, and they raised money to fund a smaller team of people to kind of go and innovate as a startup effectively. And the existing sort of Docker enterprise business, which is the bulk of the people, I think that realistically has been succeeded by Kubernetes, right? So that was now a shrinking business, and it was looking for a home, and it found one. So we can only wish those folks the best.
Because Docker has always been like a developer story, though developer tools. So now the Docker that is remaining there is still sticking to Docker for desktop and all those things, developer tools, instead of trying to sell those services.
Yeah. Look, I think it's easy to be kind of smug about something like this. It feels like somebody lost out, and it feels like something big happened. But come back to this idea that you want innovators to innovate around open source, and you also want that to be sustainable. So I think it's important if we want more startups like Docker to innovate, that in general we want them to be successful, right? In this case, lots of quite big industry players said, no, rather than having Docker be successful, we want to put a lot of time and money into making something that competes with Docker, which we'll give away for free. But I think it's important, and that's Kubernetes, but I think it's still important to think about the sustainability of Kubernetes, right? It's a reasonable argument that very large companies will fund it and give it away for free forever, because they're saying that they will do that. But there's also lots of times in history where they've changed their minds, right? So I think we shouldn't be too smug. I think I'm very glad that Docker innovated. I wish they'd been able to find a path to sustainability. And I think my focus is on delivering Kubernetes in a sustainable way, in partnership with the people who ultimately, between them, are really covering the cost of Kubernetes in a way that works for them. It's important to me to help Google with their Kubernetes offering, help Microsoft with their Kubernetes offering, help Amazon with their Kubernetes offering. I'm not in a position to sort of pick and choose. I want to make sure that it's as efficient for them, it's as effective for them, and it's therefore as sustainable for everybody as possible.
You're here at KubeCon. What has been your observation? We're all thinking day one, or if you look at it, day two, depending on if you consider yesterday as day zero. You were the keynotes. What has been
off by one? It's a very interesting time, right? Whenever anything sort of really new and exciting comes along, you have there's a rapid growth in people's sense of the potential and the possibility, right? That sort of like explodes. Everything's, this thing, it has amazing potential. And then behind that, there's growth of the awareness of the limitations or the difficulties, right? And so you get this moment where people are maximally aware of all of the upside and excitement, right? And they're not yet really aware of the difficulties or the downside. So that's kind of like peak Kubernetes, maybe. And I think we're there now, right? Clearly, everybody sees that Kubernetes is a common language for a certain class of operations, and that has tremendous potential, right? We're not yet really in a position where we can say what the limits of that are. How much of the legacy estate is actually going to come into Kubernetes, or what's next after Kubernetes, right? Both of those are uncertain propositions. So this is almost like the peak enthusiasm point, right?
I think right now everybody looks at Kubernetes as a hammer, and everybody looking at a nail.
Trying to find a way.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. Look, I think the thing that in the end will matter is that the Kubernetes offerings from a variety of the infrastructure providers are super cost effective to acquire and operate. So although we do have Kubernetes offerings, our first recommendation to people is use the Kubernetes that comes in your cloud infrastructure. So Ubuntu is part of the Kubernetes offerings from IBM, Microsoft, Google, Amazon. You can consume EKS with Ubuntu. And my first instinct is to essentially invest with those companies in helping those stories be super reliable, easy to operate, easy to get. And the fact that we can essentially work across them means we can enable a certain kind of compatibility, right? We can make sure that your AI ML workload can run in any of those places. So you can do dev, test, and staging and production in different environments if you want. But even though those are different Kuberneteses, they all have Ubuntu in them, and you have a consistency and a compatibility to that. In the end, that gives everybody the cheapest, most reliable, least complex way of getting Kubernetes, right? As a layer above that, we can also work with people, to essentially make more customizable and complex scenarios, easy to manage and operate. But I think that's a sort of a fallback plan for people who can't just simplistically consume the cloud Kubernetes in whatever environment they are, private cloud or public cloud. In general, I think, a lot of the sort of vendor enthusiasm here for Kubernetes will evaporate when people start to realize that in the end, Azure customers mostly should be using AKS. Google customers mostly should be using GKE. Amazon customers mostly should be using EKS, right? The Kubernetes itself isn't the point.
I mean, I don't want to say that, but is it sound like OpenStack 2.0? Or the good thing is that CNCF has looking at the ecosystem there. They might have learned a lot of lessons.
I think so. Yeah, there are many things that are different. There are some things that are the same. They're the vendors who sort of came here hoping that being part of Kubernetes would essentially give them a safe place to compete, an easy place to compete with the big cloud vendors will struggle, right? The reality is the economics dictate long-term behaviors, and if you're an expensive enterprise vendor, then having a K product doesn't change the dynamics, right? You're still an expensive enterprise vendor.
If you just look at the sponsorship logos there, the platinum or the diamond sponsorship looks like bronze sponsorship there are so many logos there you cannot even figure out which logo is where.
Right.
So I think we covered some base topics. One question everybody would want to ask, so I'm going to ask either way. It's been 15 years for Canonical. Mostly companies that get acquired or they go public. So you have plans for IPO? Just any update?
Yes, we reached a critical milestone this year where I think we're effectively break even. So that's a sustainability metric that I wanted to achieve. Our enterprise business is growing very strongly. People, Ubuntu has been widely used in the enterprise by developers for a very long time. Now the business people behind those organizations are starting to realize that they can significantly improve the cost of their on-prem infrastructure and accelerate their development. So that gives us a nice sort of enterprise business growth story. Those are two of the big things that I wanted to get right for us to line up for an IPO. Our public cloud relationships are very strong. Those are very important partnerships for us. We think that's a huge new wave in compute, and being the best platform on all the public clouds is really important for us. The last piece of the puzzle is really IoT, and I'm very excited at the level of adoption we're seeing for Ubuntu Core, which is essentially the exact same libraries and security updates that you get with classic Ubuntu, desktop and server, but packaged so that it's very, very cheap to run on millions of devices, right? Very cheap to essentially run on autopilot with nobody looking at it, automatically getting security updates. That's a very hard technical problem to solve. But I think now some big companies are recognizing that we've got something very special there. And so we see lots of devices getting made with Ubuntu Core or designed to be made with Ubuntu Core. The developer story there is the standard Ubuntu developer story. The operation story is dramatically simpler, right? And therefore cheaper and more reliable, right? So I'm very excited about that. It's quite a fragmented landscape, so robots, cars, digital signage, industrial control systems, networking equipment. It's kind of hard to put a finger on just one thing there, but it's fantastically diverse. And for me, that's the last piece that I really want to see very clearly commercially successful before I think we'd be ready to take the next step.
But do you need to go public? I mean, Pivotal is a very good example. They went public, and then VMware ended up kind of acquiring them. You can remain a private company.
I like the Pivotal story. Mm-hmm. I think I understand why they went through that journey. In the end, there are certain things that really want to be part of an infrastructure platform, and I think Pivotal as part of VMware makes sense, right? I think it makes sense that inside VMware you have the ability to push a button and get a Kubernetes, right? I wouldn't want to be selling against VMware to deliver Kubernetes on VMware, right? So that sequence of events makes sense to me. I think as an independent platform that works across all the clouds and across all the different kinds of silicon, from IoT to public cloud, that independence is something we really, really value. That means I'd rather chart a course for the company that is independent. I won't be around forever, and so I need to have a plan that essentially looks like it will continue to attract talent and reward talent. An IPO is a good way to do that. I've seen a lot of damage done by companies that lost their minds because of stock tickers, right? So culturally, I'm trying to make sure that we're pretty grounded about what we do, right? It's not, of course it's a change, but I'm trying to keep everybody grounded as we get ready for that change. But I do think it's the right course to set.
Yeah, because we are living in a world where a tweet can tank your stocks, so...
Sure. Part of that cultural thing is to say, if you're on the inside and you think that tweet is nonsense, then why would you worry?
Right.
You can't freak out about the stock price. Now, it's easy to say that.
Yeah.
The reality is everybody feels it. It is an extra discipline, and I've seen a lot of companies lose their minds over it. I hope, we've weathered a lot of, mailing list crises and flame fests.
But you have mellowed down a lot. You
think?
From your Shuttleworth, the blog post that you post, I have not seen anything,
Fair enough. Yes, fair enough.
So, because earlier we used to hear on monthly and weekly basis, and then something will start mailing list and the blog post will pick it up without even talking.
I guess that is one of the things I learned. I have very strong opinions about what's going to work, right? And by and large, things have worked out. But what I learned is that if you go out and say to people, hey, we have a difference of opinion, then it turns into an argument. And the reality is we have our views. It's better just to, be calm and go and do the good work, right? Come back to some of the sort of the famous controversies around Canonical. I think I made a mistake in getting drawn into arguments about whether something would work. Much better just to say, okay, look, we really believe in this. We do good quality work. People will judge the work, right, rather than the ideology. So yes, in that sense, you're absolutely right. I guess we have mellowed.
I think that is something to do with South Africans, because Elon Musk, he also goes on Twitter. What you used to do 2 or 3 years ago, he's doing these days. So maybe he'll also mellow down at some point.
Maybe, yeah.
When you're mentioning IoT, I was at LF Edge. They organized a hackathon, so I went there to cover it. And one thing that people were using more was less about Ubuntu Core. They're using snaps.
Yes.
Everybody was, so I think that is becoming a critical piece in the edge computing world.
Yes, and you remember that those were briefly controversial as well, right? And I think that's a good example where we said, okay, let's not get into an argument over this. If we think something, could be really good, let's focus on the technology, let's focus on quality, let's focus on the experience and get that right. And now, yes, we see lots of people who love the fact that they can essentially get that DevOps experience to desktops and devices, right? They can push out a new version of a snap, and within 3 days, it's everywhere, right? So that's really valuable for people. Ubuntu Core says, okay, let's get that idea on every piece of code on the device. All Ubuntu Core is a version of Linux where the OS itself is a snap and all the apps are snaps. So the things that you see people starting to really love about snaps, you get that about the whole OS, right? Now that does make it an uncomfortable place to sit and hack, because it's designed to stop that, right? It's designed to say, look, this thing can't be modified. You need a new version of the snap. That's the only way to modify it and move it forward, right? So I think there will always be room for classic Linux Ubuntu, where you can touch any file, you can do whatever you like, you can be a crazy hacker, you can do whatever you want, right? And then there'll be a room for, where we've got armies of devices that are completely on rails, where nobody wants to go in and look at them, but they want to know that they can move forward reliably. That'll be, snaps serve that world really, really well. I'm so excited that you saw like a ton of happy snapping going on.
Yeah,
right?
it was. Yeah, it was really exciting. So we are here at KubeCon, So any announcement you made, or what is Canonical doing at KubeCon?
The big story for us this year compared to last year is talking to a much wider range of personalities inside the enterprise about Kubernetes. Last year it was the labs and it was the super clever people who are always breaking the rules effectively, who were in love with Kubernetes. This year, I think inside the enterprise, there's a much wider understanding that Kubernetes is a thing that the enterprise wants. So now it's a question of kind of checking all the boxes, dotting the I's and crossing the T's. So our big announcement last week was that we are going to enable in Charmed Kubernetes and in microkates, we're going to enable the use of enterprise SQL databases as the kind of core data store for Kubernetes clusters. Early versions of Kubernetes were designed to use etcd. Etcd is a key value database. It's really good. There's nothing wrong with it. It's reliable. It's high availability. All of those things. But if you're an enterprise IT compliance person and you have to make sure that every piece of data is backed up and encrypted and that there's someone who can fix it at 2:00 in the morning, then you don't really want a new data store, right? Even if it's a good data store, it's a whole pile of work that you don't really want. So we announced that we were going to enable people to use their standard enterprise SQL databases, Oracle, SQL Server, Postgres, MySQL, the cloud databases, as backends for Kubernetes clusters. So that's, I think, an indication of the fact that the enterprise now is moving from a world where that's okay for the rocket scientists to run, Kubernetes is something for rocket scientists, to saying, okay, let's assume we're going to have Kubernetes all across the enterprise, right? Then our backup people need to be happy with it, our ops people need to be happy about it, our data security and integrity people need to be happy with it. So I think that's Kubernetes maturing, and that's also an indication of Canonical maturing and having conversations with a broader enterprise audience.
And if you look at the Canonical's product catalog, so where does this fit into the Canonical's offering?
So I'd say our first offering is to partner with the public and private infrastructure providers in their Kubernetes offerings to make sure that the OS, Kubernetes, and developer experience is first class, and I do that purely because I think in the end that's where most people should end up, right? That would be the most efficient place for them to be. They'll have all the guarantees of Canonical behind Ubuntu and all the guarantees of their cloud provider or private infrastructure provider wrapped around something that just works. So that's our first sort of Kubernetes offering. Our second Kubernetes offering is Charmed Kubernetes, which essentially is if you want to take all of the many parts of CNCF Kubernetes and you have a particular architecture you want to build, Charms will let you do that very eloquently. You should only do that if genuinely the infrastructure Kubernetes from the public cloud provider that you've chosen or the private cloud provider that you've chosen doesn't work for you. But if you need that complexity, then Charmed Kubernetes will do it really well. Microkates, which is essentially saying, okay, this is the simplest Kubernetes you can put on an IoT device or a developer desktop. Those are kind of our own Kubernetes offerings. And this sits behind that, right? So this is enterprise SQL databases sitting behind those Kubernetes offerings from Canonical.
So before we wrap this up, we are at the end of 2019 and we are heading towards 2020.
It's officially the future next year. I realize that. Like my whole life, 2020 was the future. It's a little scary to be there.
Yeah. So what are your predictions? What do you think about? Are you excited about it? Of course you will be. But where do you see the whole enterprise cloud-ready world is heading towards?
Well, on public cloud, I think now the enterprise is really starting to build deep relationships with their chosen cloud providers. We've seen a lot of large organizations essentially saying, okay, I want to work carefully with the major providers, and then I want to choose one or two that are going to be my cloud partners. So we're starting to see organizations realize that that's the work they have to do, those are the choices they have to make. We start to see them making those choices and looking to us essentially to make sure that they can get the maximum capability out of their 1, 2, 3 cloud providers. On private cloud, it's interesting. I think we're starting to see a realization that if you can run a totally automated data center, that there is still good value in having private infrastructure. So on private cloud, it's really about total automation, right? Again, if we're going to take the cost of running a data center from where it is today with VMware and co to being much lower, then it has to be all open source, it has to be all automated. So that's the sort of private cloud story. I think Kubernetes, that's done. That layer now, I think everybody understands that. So I guess the question is, what's up above that? For me, what's really exciting is the explosion in GitHub and the incredible diversity of stuff that we're seeing there, combined with the beginnings of serverless as a general purpose proposition, right? Bringing serverless out of its initial role as a kind of glue framework inside public clouds. So maybe we'll see the beginnings of that really start to take root in 2020.
And service mesh is also there, that is also becoming a big,
Yeah, I don't really know how to read service meshes. Mm-hmm. I think they're important, but I can't see how to pick a winner in that environment, because they end up, again, if you've chosen Amazon, then the service mesh that comes from Amazon is going to connect you to more of the services in Amazon more easily, right? So I'm not sure that there's really a market for service meshes as a thing independent of the underlying thing, right? We'll see. I could be wrong.
Awesome. Thank you, Mark. We won't be seeing each other this year, but I'm looking forward to seeing you again next year. And once again, thank you.
Let me wish you a very happy new year wherever you are.
Same to you.
All right.